Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, October 7th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of North Carolina and new data out of the state showing that Governor Roy Cooper, the Democratic governor who served up until this past year, is now shattering fundraising records in the state, raising $14.5 million in the last quarter alone, with 65 days leading up to this fundraising tally that is a record for any Senate challenger in the country in U.S. history leading into this first quarter. A massive amount with just 2 months to do it. Democrats in North Carolina very much seem supercharged by the idea of Governor Roy Cooper running for U.S. Senate in this state, and it very much is translating to a tangible difference. Now, in the last presidential election, I think what is the most understood and known factor of fundraising in that election was that Kamala Harris outspent Donald Trump, or at least out-fundraised when it came down to an individual statewide basis as well on the national stage. And so I think there's a lot of hesitancy in really going through what the fundraising numbers say and what impacts they might have, but genuinely speaking, as it pertains to congressional elections, they are often much higher indicators of success and victory than you might think. We can actually take a look at this from Open Secrets. They've been tracking money and politics for as long as I can remember. We've been using them since I started this channel in 2017, and they have this tab here where they do it and update it every election, questioning, did money win? And so they often ask, on these races that were the most expensive, and in the ones where the Senate Republican or the Senate Democrat outspent their opponent, how often did they win by in their races? Well, it was the highest it had been in a very long time in the 2024 cycle, and it has increasingly gotten more and more accurate in terms of outspending and winning. 88% of Senate candidates who out-fundraised their opponents and outspent them ended up winning their Senate election. So it's not a perfect science, but it's certainly a lot more tangible and directly understood than on the presidential level, where we can even talk about a bit in another video about the influence of Elon Musk's money. You know, $1 out of $4 spent in favor of Trump came directly from Elon Musk. So that election was very different because, yes, Donald Trump and his coordinated PACs may not have raised as much as Kamala Harris, but actually went 1-to-1 in terms of how much they spent. So a very different conversation needs to be had there. Focusing back in on North Carolina, though, these numbers are insane. $14.5 million in just about 2 months is truly something that you don't see every single day, right? When you look at the numbers here, especially even on the Republican side, where Michael Whatley is probably the most well-connected Republican nominee for Senate that North Carolina has seen, maybe not necessarily to the state, but in terms of national, branch and national reach, he served as the RNC chair through the 2024 election. So there's a lot of people who know him, right? When you think about the way that the 2025 cycle or 2024 cycle had gone, Michael Whatley was essentially that point person for all these Republican congressional candidates, all these Republican Senate candidates. It's not lost on me that he should be raising more money than where he is right now. That's just how it is. But he is not doing it because this race is not one that Republicans are supercharged about. This is not a race that, despite having the incumbency factor in this race, despite, Tom Tillis, who's, leaving office now, he's decided that he's going to not run for re-election. He initially had declared that he was going to. Republicans don't see this as their easiest opportunity in 2026. And so I think, in a way, it kind of worries them about wasting money in a race where Roy Cooper, as the former Democratic governor, popular and has never lost an election in North Carolina ever, they believe he's probably on track for victory, which is why there isn't as much conversation and energy and enthusiasm and money, quite frankly, behind Michael Whatley. Now, don't let this get lost in the weeds, though, that this race is absolutely still going to be a competitive one. On the last presidential level, Donald Trump won against Kamala Harris in the state of North Carolina by roughly 3 points. And the last time there was a Senate election that coincided with Donald Trump winning the state was in 2020, and that was then Senator Tom Tillis, who's now not running for re-election, outperformed Donald Trump in this state. Now, obviously, a lot of things, if you remember that 2020 cycle, Cal Cunningham had a very huge scandal in the final month of the campaign that really tanked his Senate bid across the state. But Tom Tillis, still probably may not have won if the scandal had never happened, but I don't know if necessarily I believe the scandal had impacted it to a degree that Cal Cunningham would have had an easy victory. I think it would have been a toss-up. I think I wouldn't have been able to call it, and we would not have been able to know for quite some time. But Tom Tillis still probably would have done better, at least, than what the polls were predicting. The point is, though, that Tom Tillis in North Carolina and in 2020 and in 2024, Republicans have done quite well. So for Democrats to do well in 2026, they needed the right candidate, and the right candidate they have. And this race is expected to be one of the most expensive, not just in North Carolina history, but potentially in the United States. The amount of money that is expected to be spent in North Carolina is expected to be quite tremendous. It says operatives in both parties estimate that spending in this one Senate race alone is going to reach $650 million to $800 million. Do you know how incomprehensible that is? Obviously, right? This is insane amounts of money that is being thrown at this North Carolina Senate race. These are numbers that made 2016 presidential numbers, right? The amount of money spent in that race, at least when it came down, I remember you could read the headlines on this. Hillary Clinton's fundraising record in the 2016 election in 1 month was $63 million besides the final month. You always have to take that out because it's the final stretch of the campaign, but through all of the energy and enthusiasm for Clinton at the time, and obviously wasn't as built up as it was for whoever it might be, but looking at the amount of money raised for a presidential candidate was $63 million in 1 month. Roy Cooper being able to reach that, not reach 63 million, but reach significant amounts that they're now tracking on both sides, the spending to be similar to that of the 2016 presidential election, the 2012 presidential election, the 2008 presidential election. It is fascinating. And it really goes to show just how much money has become so integral into our political system and why, when it comes down to it, that's why 88% of candidates on the Senate side who outspend their opponents win. Because money drives in a lot in these races. And a lot of this number of the people who are inaccurate came from really competitive races that potentially there could have been, different results when it came down to the election. If we actually take a look, let's go ahead and just find here the most expensive races of the last cycle in 2024. When it came down to it, Texas Senate race, well, there the Democrats spent $100 million and outpaced Kamala Harris by 7. The Ohio Senate race, the Democrat outpaced Kamala Harris by 7, and it was $141 million spent across the state. In Montana, the Democrat outpaced Kamala Harris by 10 in this state. I mean, you can actually find the results here. We can just take a look at the Senate ones. So you can see that while a lot of money was spent in Montana, actually, he outran Kamala Harris by 13 in the state. Obviously, it translated into money here. In Maryland's Senate race, a lot of Republican money there. They outpaced Donald Trump, but still did not win. So a lot of these races where maybe the Democrats did outspend or the Republicans outspent the Democrats, it did not always translate for a victory on that side of the aisle, even though it absolutely was a massive contributor in narrowing up the races. Because we can say this here. If $100 million got Democrats a 7-point advantage in Texas, and $80 million got us Democrats a 7-point advantage in Ohio, and, $80 million got Democrats a 13-point advantage in Montana, and you average that out in terms of overperformance, it is very clear what that amount of money would do in a state that Donald Trump only won by 3. It absolutely would boost and bolster the Democrat here being Roy Cooper, where you are already finding that Democrats across the country are excited, and in North Carolina, a huge sum of money coming directly to Roy Cooper, who stands to be the most viable Democrat for Senate since Kay Hagan in 2008, which gives Democrats a reason to be excited and absolutely something to fight for. And despite this very daunting threat, that this race itself might be gone to the Democratic Party, that Roy Cooper could be taking a race the Republicans historically have relied on in the 2020 Senate cycle, in the 2014 Senate cycle. They relied on it countlessly just for votes in general. If Tom Tillis had not been in the U.S. Senate today, there's no doubt in my mind that some of these cabinet officials that made it through on a J.D. Vance broken tie would not have made it through, and Donald Trump's cabinet would look dramatically different. Races like these are tremendously important. And they're not congressional elections, right? I think the thing that we confuse here is that while these elections seemingly happen all the time, the Senate terms are 6 years when the congressional ones are 2. So while we can talk a lot about congressional races, and we do it all the time, I mean, every 2 years, every single House seat is up for re-election. When it comes down to the Senate side, This seat, should Roy Cooper hold it, will not be touchable for the GOP until at least 2032, a very long way away. And so if Michael Whatley is really raising quote-unquote record $6 million in the North Carolina Senate campaign, and Roy Cooper is over doubling it in the same amount of time, it is really clear to me exactly what direction this race is going. And while I don't think it'll be a slam dunk for Roy Cooper insofar that I don't think he'd win by anything more than 5 points, given the constraints of the state and its electoral voting history, he is on track for victory today, he will be on track for victory tomorrow, and he will be on track for victory in a month from now. And while things can change over the coming year, this amount of money already being poured into this North Carolina race, which might I add, right, the amount of money spent, for instance, Texas, was the most expensive Senate race in the last cycle. But when it comes down to population, Texas has nearly 3 times the amount of people that North Carolina has. And so the media markets there are expensive. You have massive cities, huge rural areas, a massive state by land, right? The second largest state in the country, besides Alaska, which is number 1. And you think about the Texas Senate race, absolutely it makes sense that it was the most expensive race. But if you are even coming close to where potentially even more will be spent on this race than in Texas in a presidential election year, in opposition to Ted Cruz, with the Democrat who had fundraised a crap ton in that cycle, Republicans have another thing coming. And that is what has been very clear about this 2026 Senate race, which is that in North Carolina, as it stands right now, it is Roy Cooper, who is the tried and tested incumbent. Obviously, not the incumbent, but everybody knows him, has 100% name ID, and get this, wasn't just governor of North Carolina, he was attorney general and majority leader of the North Carolina Senate and a member of the state House of Representatives. He has been in elected office since 1987, and never once has he lost an election. He has been vetted countlessly, even to a point that in 2012, Republicans would not even run a candidate against him in that North Carolina Attorney General's race. They would not even run someone to go up against him in 2012 because they knew that they would lose. 4 years later, he would go on to unseat a Republican incumbent when Donald Trump had a massive overperformance on the national stage. And in 2020, despite Donald Trump winning the state and Republicans winning the Senate election in North Carolina, it is Governor Roy Cooper who won in the governor's race by 5 points against none other than the lieutenant governor who was elected 4 years prior. So, when we think about the Senate races here, like I said, Democrats have every reason to be excited about North Carolina because it is the one state that, while it has may have voted against it in the past, is absolutely on a pathway and a trend line that is beneficial for the Democratic Party as it pertains to this race. And if Democrats get to a point where they are able to win North Carolina by a pretty significant amount, it probably suggests that the money that might have been spent in North Carolina could be spent elsewhere, and that the 2026 midterms probably are going their way. Raising $14.5 million is no small feat. It really is a massive, massive amount. And when I think just too about, what Republicans can expect to see in terms of an onslaught of ads and money and experience and energy in this race, Michael Whatley is certainly not the Republican to combat it. Because their bench has already been either in the U.S. Senate or doesn't want to run against Roy Cooper, Michael Whatley is not necessarily the sacrificial lamb because there's still a chance that he could win this Senate race, but absolutely in the way that it means the Republicans probably aren't going to win this Senate race, and a lot of these Republicans that might be higher up in North Carolina or believe they have some level of political ambition are reading the writing on the wall and knowing that 2026 is not their year. Because 2026 is expected to be much better for the Democratic Party, trying to take on somebody as powerful as Roy Cooper in North Carolina is probably not going to happen. And as much as they can raise the record $6 million, in the same amount of time, the Democrats actually break records with $14.5 million with the exact same amount of time, the exact same amount of days. Roy Cooper in North Carolina is shattering records, and it's showing the Democrats are excited, they're enthusiastic, and they feel that North Carolina's Senate race is absolutely worth fighting for. And given a lot of these numbers, my honest take is the Democrats are much likelier to win in North Carolina than they think. It's not a guarantee. It's not a slam dunk, as I said before. but it absolutely is something that you could count on today in ways you could not have historically in this state. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.